Today's lecture focuses on Buddhism, a religion which, like Hinduism, arose in India, but today it's spread throughout all of Eastern Asia and indeed in the West as well. We're going to look at Buddhism as a counter-reaction to Hinduism, look at its various strands, and tell some stories from the primary source reader. This lecture covers both days on the syllabus. First, for the historical background of Buddhism, the Buddha was just a normal man. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince or a royal figure. You wouldn't think of him as a prince over all of India, though. He was a royal person for his local area, which is in modern-day Nepal, just north over the Himalaya mountains from northern India. He too is born in the Axial Age, about 563 BC, in a similar way that Lao Tzu and Confucius and the others we've talked about came about on the scene in religious history. The term Buddha means awakened one. It comes from the Hindu root bud, to be awakened. And as I said, it's kind of a Hindu anti-religion. One of the questions we're going to want to examine as we go through this is, did he even mean to found a religion at all? And is modern Buddhism compatible with him or not? We'll also think about how, where it would fit in the Chesterton categories of God, gods, demons, philosophers. I have a couple maps here. One of them you can see the Buddhist sacred sites. I got to visit one of these, Bodh Gaya, which is Buddha's birthplace, and I'll show you some pictures from that later. Then this next slide here shows the current Buddhist population, and you can see that China contains the vast majority of Buddhists, but also Japan, Mongolia, and other countries in Southeast Asia have a significant population. We're going to take a look at some stories from your primary source reader. If you want to look it up and follow along, feel free. This is on Novak, page 50, Buddha's birth. It's a miraculous birth, and it has some parallels with Jesus's actually, and we're going to compare and contrast that. There lived once upon a time a king of the Shakyas, a scion of the solar race. ... He had a wife who was called the great Maya. These two tasted of love's delights, and one day she conceived the fruit of her womb, but without any defilement. Just before her conception she had a dream. A white elephant seemed to enter her body, but without causing her any pain. She set her heart on going to Lumbini, a delightful grove. The newborn babe came out of his mother's side without causing her any pain of injury. And since he had for many eons been engaged in the practice of meditation, he was now born in full awareness. So think about that in terms of Jesus' birth here. You have, as in Christianity, a miraculous conception, no defilement in the mother, no pain or injury in childbirth, which is the tradition associated with Mary as well. Buddha's born in full awareness because he's existed for many eons. That is to say, been reincarnated, and he's always been around. Just like Jesus is aware that he's God. Now, where the differences begin to appear is we don't believe that Jesus could do calculus and that he could explain the concept of God being his father as a one-day-old child. There are apocryphal or heretical gospels that show that, and we'll see that in discussing Islam later. But here you have a Buddha, unlike Jesus, who's fully aware, already ready to teach from the womb. But is this basically the same thing as Christianity and Jesus' birth? A lot of people will compare the two figures and say they're pretty much the same, just as Hindus will say Jesus is just an avatar of Vishnu. Well, this story of Buddha's birth, we don't even know when it came on the scene, first of all, but it was clearly removed by centuries from the time he actually lived. Jesus' birth, on the other hand, is an event in history. These are things we can show for certain that he was born in Bethlehem around the year between 5 and 3 BC, more or less. And there's a whole historical reason behind that dating, which I don't need to go into here, but we know where he was born and the date as well. I'm showing here a picture of the cave where you go down to enter Jesus' cave where he was born in the Church of the Nativity. In the slide before that, I had shown a relic or Buddha's birth spot as well. Okay, so then here's a couple more pictures. One here is going down to kiss the spot on which he's said to be born. And then this second one is a closer up shot. Now, is this the exact spot? I'd like to think so. But as the guide I had in the Holy Land said, maybe it was here, maybe it was 50 feet away, but it's pretty darn close. And that's the beautiful thing we can know about Christianity and the traditions passed down, which were already alive and well in the apostles' time, and we have very good certainty because of the Roman Empire preserving these things and even trying to cover them up and building other shrines on top of them, that it basically, in trying to get rid of Christianity, ended up preserving its sites. Next, the Buddha gets older and he has what's called the 4 passing sights. His father tries to shield him from 4 different things, and he ends up getting out of the castle one day and it finds an old man. Then he finds a body racked with disease. Then he comes across a corpse. And in seeing these things, he has that vanity moment of, how can I continue my life like this and go on living this pleasure, hedonistic existence if it's going to end up like this, if I'm going to be a corpse? So this prompts him to ask the question, where is the realm where there is neither age nor death? And here he encounters a wandering ascetic monk, a sannyasin, which we learned about in Hinduism. And that's what prompts him to go on this excursion and journey to figure out what is the meaning of life. And you have a couple of pictures here. This is from a Buddhist temple in Bodh Gaya, the sacred city where he was said to be born. One is him sitting under the lotus tree, where he decided he was going to stay until he found enlightenment. And the other one is a mural that has the 4 passing sights in it. And you can see the old man, for example, in the bottom left of that site. The great going forth refers to him leaving his family and going as a forest dweller for 6 years. So following the Hindu tradition of retirement and going out and experimenting with all the different Hindu methods, such as asceticism and meditation and the various yogas. When these fail, through meditation he arrives at a middle way. In contrast with the excesses that he observed in Hindu asceticism, this would be not indulgence on the one hand, but not a rigorism on the other hand that would dehumanize you and make you sick through too much fasting. And under that Bodhi tree then, he has the great awakening, and they call that the immovable spot today. He has a series of temptations he receives from the demoness Mara, which is also interesting because you have the temptations in a similar way that Christ was tempted. And you can read about this in Novak, pages 56 through 59. The greatest temptation for him, though, was, who's going to understand and follow me? The temptation to despair, which is a perennially perhaps the greatest temptation. But he says, well, there are a few people who understand. So he leaves and he attains this enlightenment, and now he's the Buddha, and he goes forth. Here in Bodh Gaya, these pictures, you can see the Bodhi tree itself. And there's some monks here praying. There's a relic of Buddha's foot there. And then this wall is where the Buddha is said to have walked and meditated. One interesting thing there about that is, just behind that wall, about a month after we were in India, back in 2013, there was a bomb and exploded on that staircase there. So there is violence around between Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims sometimes, although generally not right there in that spot. And there you have a picture of Buddha being tempted and the 3 offspring of Mara, the vices that are tempting him. This picture here is of Jesus' temptation, and this is the mountain where Jesus was tempted, taken from below near the town of Jericho, and there's a monastery built on the very top of that. Next, we're going to take a look about Buddha's ministry and his pattern of withdrawal and return to the world. I think Smith does a good job of pointing out how withdrawal from the world is basic to all human creativity, and I would say basic to holiness as well. You need times to step away, to refresh, to have retreat. Buddha then retreats for 6 years before he begins his ministry. And then every year he is said to have retreated 3 months, and then also 3 months, 3 times each day. Same thing with Christians. We need to step back each day and have time for prayer, for mass, or meditation. We need to have a weekend a year perhaps to go on a retreat. And when a person is discerning vocation, they need even more than that. Is Buddhism a religion? The next main section of our discussion. Smith calls him the rebel saint. He rejects the 6 basic aspects of Hinduism, and that's why I say you would call it more of a Hindu anti-religion than a religion. The first thing is authority. The Hindu Brahmins or priests are not authoritative. Buddha says, be lamps unto yourselves. This reminds me of the modern European Enlightenment, wherein Immanuel Kant gives it its motto to say, have the courage to use your own reason. And he tries to create a religion in his book, Religion Within the Limits of Human Reason Alone. I should not say he tries to create a religion, but he tries to interpret Christianity within reason apart from revelation. Similar thing going on here with Buddha, interpreting the whole tradition in light of reason alone. Number 2, he rejects ritual. Hinduism can fall into superstitions, sacrificing to appease the gods. He thinks that these are basically one of the 10 fetters that bind the human spirits. And therefore, we should get rid of the rituals and look at rational worship. What does that consist in? Number 3, he rejects speculation. And this is perhaps the most important one that I'm going to dwell on with you. It is called his noble silence on metaphysical questions, that Buddha believes there is a thicket of theorizing that tends not towards edification. Don't think about it if it's not going to edify you. It's proper to doubt, to be uncertain. That's okay for Buddha. He tells this parable, the arrow, which you can find on Smith, page 95. There are 10 unanswered questions that Buddha says it's okay if they remain unanswered. And those, for your information, are found on Novak, page 63. Let me read you this parable, the arrow, and I'll abbreviate it a little bit. It is as if a man had been wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and kinsmen were to get a surgeon to heal him, and he were to say, I will not have this arrow pulled out until I know by what man I was wounded, whether he was of the warrior caste, or of agricultural or lowest caste. Or if he were to say, I will not have this arrow pulled out until I know what name of the family the man was, or whether he was tall or short or middle height, or whether he's black or dark or yellowish, or whether he comes from such and such a town or city. And he goes on listing all these different things he wants to know before he'll have his arrow pulled out. He wants to know what the arrow was made out of, whether the shaft was from a wild or a cultivated plant. And he says, before knowing all this, what would happen to that man? He would die. Similarly, it is not on the view that the world is eternal, that it is finite, that the body and soul are distinct, or that the Buddha exists after death, that our religious life depends. Whether these views or their opposites are held, there is still rebirth, there's still old age, there's still death, grief, lamentation, suffering, sorrow, and despair. I have not spoken to these views because they do not conduce to absence of passion or to tranquility and nirvana. The 10 unanswered questions then are these. Whether the world is eternal or not. That's the first 2. Whether the world is finite or not. Whether the soul is one thing and the body another. Or that the person who has achieved nirvana exists after death or does not. Or both, or neither. These are the great questions which Christianity thinks are really important that we answer, actually. Is the world eternal or not? Well, we talked about this in primal religions. It's a datum of our faith that the world is not eternal. Whether it's finite. Yes, it's finite. Only God is infinite in Christianity. Buddhism doesn't know, though. And more importantly, probably, whether the soul is distinct from the body. We believe that's really important because your body disintegrates when you die, and your soul does not. And then that leads into the last thing. So do you continue to exist after death or not, or both or neither? And I love it how they put both or neither in there. It's contradictory, of course, but that's part of what Buddha's recognizing here. It's a question you don't know the answer to. So maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. Maybe you exist and don't exist. But again, Christianity thinks the answer to that's really important. The way you're going to live your life depends a whole lot on whether you exist after you die or not. Next we come to tradition. Buddha rejects the idea that we should be using Sanskrit as the language if you're a Hindu, and he teaches in the vernacular. He also rejects all the, we might call the oral traditions. Grace, number 5. You're not saved by intercession of any of these Hindu gods. You're saved by self-effort alone. In Christianity, we would call this Pelagianism, where he says, work out your own salvation with diligence. Buddhas only point the way. Teachings are like rafts. Sometimes you'll hear this Buddha in plural, and that refers to anybody who attains enlightenment. A Buddha is just someone who gets you to the point of enlightenment. And like a raft, once you're across the river, you leave behind the raft. Same thing with the Buddha. You don't remain attached to them. Number 6, mystery. By this you shall know that a man is not my disciple, namely, that he tries to work a miracle. No miracles, no mysteries, again, reason alone. So those are the 6 major aspects of religion that Hinduism rejects. The essence of the tradition can be found in the 4 noble truths, which the Buddha enunciates after his parable of the arrow. He says, well, what have I taught? Number 1, life is suffering. Dukkha. Dukkha really means dislocated, so your life is out of joint. And this is the fundamental observation of all Buddhism, that their whole religion is founded upon. A solution without a problem is meaningless, and so this is the problem. Number 2, what is the cause of it? Tanha, desire. There are different interpretations for this, but the way Smith puts it is probably most accurate. It's a desire for private fulfillment, not just any desire whatsoever, but selfishness. And number 3, the suffering is curable if we can overcome the craving. And finally, 4, the path, the Eightfold Path, is the means to overcome it. You can link these up to medical terms that might help you memorize them. The symptoms that he's observing is dukkha, suffering. The diagnosis is the cause, tanha, or private desire. The prognosis is, well, it's curable. And then finally, the prescription is the Eightfold Path. Now we'll take a look at the various steps of the Eightfold Path. The preliminary step is right association. You might call this the company of the holy. And in Christianity, you can relate to this. It's hard to become holy if you don't have any holy friends that build you up. So that's assumed in this Eightfold Path. The first one is right views. Right views mean you had to understand the 4 noble truths. You have to understand that, for example, revelation is going to help you, miracles aren't going to help you. And once you understand that all life is suffering, then you can have the right intent. The first one would apply more to your intellect. Right intent, number 2, would apply to your will, that you're sincerely aiming at the right end, that you're right intended. Number 3, right speech. So this would basically parallel in Christianity, let your yes mean yes, let your no mean no, don't lie, etc. Number 4, right conduct. And the Buddhists do have certain things you cannot do. You'd parallel this, if anything, to the 10 Commandments in Christianity, though they're obviously not exact. Number 5, right livelihood. I like what Smith says about this, that there's some things you can't do. A caravan trader Why not? No one knows really. But you can't be a brewer, and that's pretty clear because Buddhists can't drink alcohol. Again, alcohol takes away your reason, and so the livelihood of a brewer, which condones that and promotes it, is impossible to do. And then right effort would mean you've got your right intention, you've got your right concepts, but you've got to persevere. Number 7, right mindfulness. In a documentary I watched one time, this Buddhist monk was asked, "Give me the summary of Buddhism in one word." And that's incredibly hard to do, of course, but he thinks for a minute and he says, mindfulness. Because all we are is the result of what we have thought. We become what we think, like we saw in Hinduism. Mindfulness means you keep your mind on the present moment. Only right now matters. He doesn't say sin because in Hinduism, ignorance, not sin, is the offender. In this connection, I'm reminded of the Dalai Lama talking about Thomas Merton, the Catholic monk. He said that he was most impressed with Merton because of his complete attention to the person he was in contact with at the present moment. Finally, 8, right concentration. And here, this is going to lead into the important concept called anatta in a second. You see, when we truly become aware through concentration of our uncontrollable mental patterns, we realize there's no continuity or orchestrating principle behind our thoughts. In other words, if you sit down and meditate, you know how the Hindus would strip away the sheaths and get down to the Atman. Well, when you realize, hey, these thoughts are coming and going, I can't control my feelings, my skin itches, why, now it comes, now it goes. It seems like there's no stability, that everything is just coming and going. Well, the Buddha takes the Hindu observation that you can strip away the feelings, conscious and subconscious, and get to Atman, and he says, when you get down to the bottom, there's nothing. No orchestrating principle, no soul, no continuity. Once you block out all your feelings and thoughts, nothing is left. So for the doctrine of the soul, rather than calling it the Atman, the Buddhists call the soul the exact opposite, namely no soul, anatta. It comes from the privative, so if you put the A in front of a word, let's take asymmetrical, it means non-symmetrical from the Greek. Anatta means no Atman, and it's abbreviated, it's alighted together. No Atman. Deliberately a rejection of the Hindu view. Yet there is something peculiar about this. Buddha still assumes the doctrine of samsara, or rebirth. It's kind of interesting that he says this is taken for granted in his parable of the arrow, but how can he take that for granted? Well, as part of his tradition, maybe he didn't even realize he was taking that for granted. But reason alone can't prove reincarnation. So Buddha himself, we might say, was a little bit blind to that. But how do you explain reincarnation if there's no soul? The image of the candle. It's a causal relationship between one life and the next, not a relationship of identity. You're made up of these different aggregates, which they call skandhas. And think of these as your atoms. When you die and your body decomposes, those scatter to the four winds. And then they get put back together in a new body, according to Buddhists. Well, rather than being the same person or same soul, you have here one candle lighting another. Is it the same flame between candle 1 and candle 2? Not really. Candle 1 caused candle 2. And so my life now is caused by the karma of someone else's previous life. But I'm not that same person. I've seen one of my colleagues compared this to David Hume philosophy, about how this link between two different things and causality. Let me pull out this paper, actually, it's kind of interesting, from Hume. So Hume says, if any impression gives rise to the idea of self, That impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never exist all at the same time. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. And then he says one more quote, which I think is interesting. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold or light or shade or love or hatred. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long I am insensible of myself. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and I could neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate, I should be entirely annihilated. Interesting parallel there to Buddhism. So we've talked about the nature of the soul according to the Buddhism. Now the nature of ultimate reality, or God. There's no soul and there's really no God either. Ultimate reality is called shunyata, which means emptiness. The illustration for it here is this black circle with nothing in it, indicating that ultimate reality contains all things, yet none of these is permanent. The Sanskrit word there is anika, impermanence. But does that mean that it's just Maya, nothing exists at all, that kind of strict interpretation of it? Well, I would posit to you here that there's probably something more positive behind what they're saying than people think. I don't think the Buddhists are saying that nothing exists and that no God exists, but rather they're trying to drive home the point that the Godhead so far transcends your intellect that it appears as empty to you. It's also trying to drive home that nothing in this world has permanence. And as indication that they think there is some Godhead, if you will, that they can't name, you have this quote from Buddha, supposedly. There is, O monks, an unborn, which has neither been created, nor become, nor formed. Were there not an unborn, there would be no deliverance from the formed. And the unborn there is capitalized. So there is something that was never created. If not, there couldn't exist anything else at all. This is, interestingly, similar to one of the proofs of God's existence in Christianity. That there would be nothing in existence now at all if there weren't existence itself, which didn't receive existence from another. But the Buddhists are going to hesitate to put their name on that, so they just call it shunyata, or emptiness. Next, the goal of life, nirvana. Literally, it means extinction. Like the other two concepts we just talked about, though, the negativity here is probably all not that negative. It really means the extinction of your finite self. It has nothing to do with the band Nirvana. I put the picture up there. I just wanted to show you how our modern society has these words that we throw around, but most people have no clue what they mean. The extinction of your finite self, to rip open the bounds of the finite and make room for the infinite. You don't cease to exist. In fact, you don't even exist technically at all. But the aggregates that you call you in nirvana merge back into the ultimate reality, which one tradition calls shunyata, or emptiness, and continue to exist in that infinity forever. Smith points out that it's important to get the Indian view of flames if you want to understand extinction right. The Indian view of flames and going from candle to candle and one's extinguished, it's not that they are gone, but they return to their source. They go back to the beginning. Conjure up in your mind here the image of black elk from the Native American tradition, where you come forth from the Great Spirit and you return to the Great Spirit. And this reminds me of a dialogue from Hinduism, which you can find in your Novak reader, between the boy Nachiketas and the god Death. And as they're discussing here, Nachiketas wants to know what happens after death. And Death will not answer, but through all that, it insinuates that Death doesn't even know. that you continue to exist somehow, but death isn't going to even tell you what. So much is the mystery of what life of nirvana consists in. And that's why in the 10 unanswered questions, Buddha says maybe you exist after death, maybe you don't, maybe both, maybe neither. Now we're going to turn to look at the different strands or rafts of Buddhism. The word raft means is yana in Sanskrit. So you have Hinayana, which means little raft, and Mahayana, which means great raft. And I've put up here a slide side by side so you can compare these. Hinayana, which means small raft, or Theravada, the other term for it, which means way of the elders, is the original form of Buddhism. Now think back to Taoism. The original form of Taoism was philosophical. The original form of a lot of these religions is very philosophical, but it eventually becomes more religious. In Theravada, Buddha is just a saint. But then in Mahayana, the type of Buddhism that arose a few centuries later, Buddha becomes a savior. They start to pray to Buddha. The ideal or goal in life for Hinayana is to become an arhat, a wise person, and thus the key virtue is wisdom. But in Mahayana, the goal is to be a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva is wise, but they're more compassionate. Their key virtue in compassion is that they come down to earth and help other people, or they delay nirvana on purpose in order to help others get there. Then that leads to differences in the way they pray. Prayer for Hinayana is only meditation. You don't pray to another god. But in Mahayana, you have intercessory prayer. Thus, not surprisingly, Hinayana has no rituals, whereas Mahayana does. And you're saved by self-effort alone in Hinayana versus salvation through grace from a god or a Buddha in Mahayana. And then lastly, unsurprisingly, Hinayana is mostly for monks today who live in a monastery called a Sangha, whereas Mahayana is for laity in the world. Therefore, you can see that in terms of Chesterton's categories, you probably have at least two different ones operative in Buddhism. Mahayana would probably be God or the gods, and Hinayana would be philosophers. How do they view Jesus? In Hinduism, he's seen as an avatar or an incarnation of Vishnu. In Buddhism, if you're Theravada, you probably just view him as a saint, that is a holy person. But in Mahayana Buddhism, he can be viewed as a bodhisattva. Jesus emptied himself and came down from heaven in order to help other people. So that's one way that some Buddhists make sense of Jesus and try to incorporate him in their devotion. There are all different kinds of Buddhist monks, as you'll see here in these pictures from Bodh Gaya. I didn't get a chance to talk to many of them, but you have the white ones there. You have in this next picture different colors, but the saffron and red, that's the Tibetan monks. And the neat thing about our experience there was we happened to arrive on Buddha's birthday, and so there were monks from all over the world there. I'll talk about that in just a second. So this slide here just kind of brings together the thoughts I was just offering you, that in later Mahayana Buddhism, the wheel comes full circle. The very founder of Buddhism, who is an agnostic or an atheist as far as a personal God is concerned, now gets deified, made into a god. What would the Buddha have thought of this? Probably would roll over in his grave. But I would posit to you that this shows man is by nature homo religiosus, as they would say in Latin. Man is religious by nature. He wants to bow down to something. The question is what it will be. And if you try to take out that inclination to worship, it usually finds its way back in. We found that in Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and anywhere where you try to have a philosophy on its own, I think. Another strand within Buddhism, subset within the Mahayana, is called Pure Land Buddhism. And I just want to say one thing about this. They call the Buddha Amitabha Buddha, who's conceived of as this God of infinite light, and who resides in a heaven. And you attain salvation by calling on his name. Smith, in his own way, compares this to St. Paul. We wouldn't just say it's Pauline theology, but it's the idea you see in Paul where you get saved through calling on the name of Jesus. And that appears here too. Pure Land probably comes on the scene after Christianity. Does it have any influence from Christianity? Not that I know of, but it is a different approach. Another interesting strand a lot of people know about in the West, vaguely at least, is called Zen Buddhism. In Zen, we have this idea that words and reasons fall short of reality and distort it. And so we're going to have enlightenment transmitted directly from master to disciple, from Buddha mind to Buddha mind. The goal is called Satori or Kensho, depending on whether you're speaking Chinese or Japanese, which is basically the Zen equivalent of nirvana. In this moment of Kensho, you will say, I realize I have never been created. I am the cosmos. So a complete identification with all of reality, similar to the Hindu realization that your Atman is Brahman. I like how this one Buddhist saint puts it, my daily activities aren't different now, only I am naturally in harmony with them. You might compare that to the Christian conversion experience. You don't do anything differently necessarily, but it's how you do it and how you experience it that might be different. Sure, you'll perform heroic virtues perhaps you didn't before, but the ordinary task of going to school, or in my case, parenting or working, etc., you do the same material tasks, but you experience them differently because you have this enlightenment. The three key features of Zen, one is Zazen, or seated meditation. This is where you just sit down immobily and pray. And I have a cool story about this, again, a documentary I watched one time. I was impressed. They had this row of monks meditating, and they had their hands folded and they're seated there with their legs crossed, and the master's watching them, and one starts to nod off to sleep, and the master monk hits him with a ruler, and he just eases back into his position. He doesn't startle. Amazing concentration and peace. 2, Sanzen, the consultation with the spiritual master. This happens in monasteries, and that's a daily type of thing that you'd see happen sometimes in Christian monasteries as well. And then 3, for our purposes, most interesting, koans, which are mind puzzles designed to upset your mind and drive it beyond itself. Basically, the goal there is to reduce the mind to an impasse so that it realizes it can't understand the particular dilemma or parable. It requires a flash of enlightenment to bridge this gap between your present mode of existence and arrive at the Buddha mind. People will sometimes simplistically compare this to what Jesus does, but Jesus does have a similar teaching method sometimes when he says things like, I'm preaching in order that they might not understand. What does he mean by that? Or what does he mean by saying, to him who has, more will be given. To him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Well, Jesus clearly isn't advocating that the rich become richer and the poor become poorer. But through that statement, he's wanting people to ask the question, go beyond their normal way of thinking. On that note, I like the interpretation St. Faustina gives to that statement from Jesus. She says, the real meaning of Jesus' statement there is, if you live by God's grace, you'll receive even more grace. But if you reject it and you have not, you'll get even less and become even more vicious. Now let's take a look at some examples of koans. This one is not from your book, but rather from one of my old professors of Hinduism back in college that I always liked. And I'm just going to pull this up and read it really quickly to you. It's a long story, but it's about this girl named Enyadatta who loses her head. So this Enyadatta girl thinks she's all pretty. Well, one day she looks in the mirror and can't find her head. "Oh, where is my head?" she says. "Will someone please tell me where my head is?" Her friends try to calm her down, saying, "Enyadatha, your head is on your shoulders where it always has been. Stop being crazy. You have not lost your head. Stop running around looking for it." Well, they try to do everything to convince her, but finally, they tie her down and they try to talk some sense into her. And suddenly one of the friends finds a solution. He picks up a wooden stick and hits Enyadatha hard on the head. An enormously strong blow it was. In an agony of unbearable pain, Enyadatha cried, "I have my head! Oh, I do have my head!" This is her moment of kensho, her realization that she has a head. So what's the meaning of this story? Originally, Enyadatha thinks she's all great. She realizes she has this head. She's obsessed with the material world. Then she loses her head. That signifies that once she goes down the path of Buddhism, she sees that nothing really exists. Everything's empty. But then, in a flash of enlightenment, symbolized by the hitting with the stick, she suddenly realizes, oh, I do have a head. But her having a head now is different than it was before. It's that she's part of the whole cosmos. She really does exist, but not as an individual. She exists in the totality. That's what I was saying earlier, how it doesn't mean you don't exist when they say anatta or no soul. It's that you're in harmony and inextricably bound up with everything else. That's the point, is that there's no privacy, no independence, no selfish craving in Hinduism. Another very short one that drives home the same point is about a monk. Before I became a monk, I saw mountains as mountains, rivers as rivers. After I became a monk, I saw mountains as not mountains, rivers as not rivers. But now I see mountains as mountains, and rivers as rivers again. That monk went through the same process of beginning with seeing mountains as just mountains. And then his conversion makes him to see that they don't have the independent existence. There are no mountains. Then he returns and sees mountains within the greater context of reality. Other koans. These are found in your Novak reader. Bodhidharma's definition of Zen on page 95 is that it's a direct transmission of knowledge from Buddha mind to Buddha mind. So building on that, you have some direct attempts to instill or bring about Kensho. And one of my favorite ones on page 99, I'm going to use the shit stick example first. A monk asked Uman, "What is Buddha?" Uman said, "A shit stick." And wow, what is he saying there? I put up a picture here from the movie Caddyshack. There's this candy bar floating in a pool and the kids think it's a turd. Kind of funny image. It drives home the point, hopefully in a little bit of a jocular way, that the monk's calling Buddha poo. How can he say that? Well, the disciple should be meditating upon that, and he realizes, Buddha, I shouldn't hold on to. The concept of Buddha is no more worthwhile than waste. And so that shows that the only thing that matters is how I live, not who helped me or who I'm imitating. The dog, this is on page 98, letter A. A monk once asked Master Joshu, "Has the dog a Buddha nature or not?" Joshu said, "Moo," which is great. There are different interpretations of this, but it seems just a nonsensical answer that, it's stupid to ask the question. Don't ask whether the dog has a Buddha nature. It doesn't conduce to your enlightenment. Just live. Page 102. So your master's on his deathbed, and you ask him for one last piece of advice. Here's what this guy tells his disciple. Question, Master, is there anything else I need to know? No, said the master. I'm quite satisfied by and large, but there is one thing that still worries me. What is it? Well, said the master, the trouble is you still stink of Zen. In other words, a Zen Buddhist telling his disciple, you shouldn't seem so much like a Zen Buddhist anymore. Can you imagine if someone you love told you you're too Christian on their deathbed? I think what he's getting at here, if I could attempt to be the disciple and understand this cone, is that it's like Paul and Apollos in the New Testament. People say, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos. I'm this type of Christian, I'm this type. You can get more obsessed with your identity and get proud because of it, rather than focusing on God himself. 103, letter F. This sounds a lot like Taoism. There is Buddha for those who don't know what he is really. There is no Buddha for those who know what he is really. Like the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. And then lastly, page 107, the story about carrying a girl. Two monks are on a pilgrimage. They come to a ford of a river, and they see this girl who wants to get across. And one monk says, we can't help her because it's not right for a monk to touch a woman. But the other guy picks her up and carries her across the river. Well, after they put her down and go their separate ways, the one monk's been angry and finally bursts out and tells the other one, I can't believe you violated the rules for monks. But the monk who had carried the girl walked along and replied, I set her down by the river, but you are still carrying her. Ouch. So the point there is that detachment means there's a letter of the law and a spirit of the law. And in Buddhism, they're not obsessed with the letter of the law at all. But the same principle here would apply in Christianity. There are some things Christianity would say you cannot do, period. And we would go beyond Buddhism in saying that. Those are called intrinsic evils. But there are some things, let's say that you skip Mass on Sunday because you had to bring someone to the emergency room, that is excusable because you can still sanctify the day, even if technically you missed your obligation. That's very different though than saying, well, I don't feel like it, I'll just stay at home and worship today. So similar thing going on there. Next, I just want to say a comment and recommend a reading to you from a guy named Chomei, An Account of My Hut. This is a neat one to read because it shows that the essence of Buddha's teaching is detachment. And so this guy builds himself a hut and lives it and retreats away from the world, because only in a hut built for the moment can one live without fear, he says. It doesn't matter whether it gets destroyed, because the point is, I shouldn't be attached to it. In fact, I shouldn't be attached to Buddha's teaching. I could be even too attached to him. But this is a great example of Buddhist pessimism as well, because he says our life is like the dew, it evaporates as soon as it comes on the scene. It's like the wake of a boat that's here and that's gone. So don't get attached to this life too much. There's no haven in this world. Life is vanity. Don't be attached. Okay, so that carrying a girl cone and this account of my hut, which I just wanted to mention to you, are the last things there that deal with Zen Buddhist spirituality. Now we go on to Vajrayana, or the Tibetan or diamond or tantric way of Buddhism. This is very different still from the ones we've talked about. And in contrast with Zen Buddhism, this believes that you can attain enlightenment in one lifetime if you harness all the interconnected energies latent in man and mobilize them. Similar to hygienic Taoist yoga as opposed to philosophical, here you're doing physical things, motions, audio-visual assistance, gestures, chants, prostrations. Smith mentions mantras, which are oral repetitions, mudras, which are gestures, and then mandalas. Here's a picture of a mandala from a bodhisattva named Chenrezig, who's very popular in Tibetan Buddhism. The mandala is a microcosm of the whole universe, so a small universe with the 4 different directions symbolized it, and circular, of course, containing all of reality and indicating it's cyclical. And there are different deities in here which represent stages of enlightenment. Do they exist as separate deities, or are they just mental constructions? The Buddhist will leave that open. And I asked a Tibetan monk once this question. He said it doesn't matter. And the sand will be brushed away as a meditation on anicca, or impermanence. You do this whole complicated piece and then brush it away. And the offering is placed in the stream to spread the blessings that came about through that mandala. Related to that is a type of meditation called Tonglen. In the Rime Buddhist Center in Kansas City, they do this, and the students always find it kind of interesting. Some kind of fall asleep during the 10 or 15 minutes of silence, but some find it very profound. The point there is they, in their service, they have this silent time where they're told to breathe in and take in the evil of the world and breathe out love. So they're taking that evil in and trying to transform it and bring it back out. Similar to Taoism, the way it does that. There's a dedication of merit in the Buddhist service guide, which I put up on Blackboard. The dedication of merit is for all sentient beings, all intelligent beings, where you want to bring about your merit to them. And so you can compare and contrast this with redemptive suffering and intercession in Christianity. In Christianity, we don't just see it as something I'm doing. It's rather, I talk to God and ask God, let's say I did this mortification, Lord, I did this sacrifice. Can you please give this person the grace that I merited through that action? The difference again is in Christianity, we have God who's in charge of it. And we don't see it as just a action-reaction, impersonal set of forces. As this wheel of life shows, there are 6 different realms with 6 different type of beings. You have hell beings, so demons, ghosts, animals, humans, titans, and gods. But there are 2 different types of interpretations which I alluded to. The exoteric, which means outside, would indicate that these things really exist, that there really are gods, demons, and etc. The esoteric, or inside interpretation, is that these are states of your soul. Sometimes you're like a hell being, sometimes you're like an animal, sometimes you act as a god. And you want to pray to harness the energies of all those different things and live correctly through them. Each of the different realms has a different kind of suffering. And so animals suffer from being dumb, humans suffer from being craving pleasure, and gods suffer. I believe their explanation there has to do something with power. Within Vajrayana Buddhism, the notion of Tantra is kind of interesting. And I think it's dangerous, but it should be mentioned. They focus on this goddess Tara, which represents the feminine aspect of the divine, and sees sex as an epiphany of God if it's joined to love. There's one parable which is on page 91 of this Novak book, which I'd like you to consider. It's called "With Impurity the Wise Make Themselves Pure." The mystics pure of mind dally with lovely girls. Water in the ear is removed by more water, a thorn in the side by another thorn. So wise men rid themselves of passion by yet more passion. As a washerman uses dirt to wash a garment clean, so with impurity the wise man makes himself pure. I would say here is a danger that you see when people try to incorporate this type of philosophy into New Age Western thinking, and that is, are you really going to make yourself pure by indulging in something? I think sometimes in the spiritual life it's tempting to say, well, I'm going to cave in and allow this vice because I need to let it burn out, so to speak. But Christianity would see a problem with that. So no, you don't get to use sexual indulgence to overcome your craving. Central to Tibetan Buddhism is something people know about a little bit in the West, and that's the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama is an incarnation of the Bodhisattva Chenrezig, which I mentioned earlier. And there's a whole interesting process by which they identify him as a child. But there's another Lama called the Panchen Lama, who is himself an incarnation of Amitabha Buddha. And he's the one that's supposed to select the Dalai Lama, who they put a series of objects in front of him, and he recognizes those from his previous lifetimes. Currently, the Dalai Lama is in exile from Tibet. There's a story about this that's really nice to watch in the movie 7 Years in Tibet, which, while a popular movie, is really good. And the Dalai Lama has been preaching throughout the world about nonviolence and Tibetan freedom for decades. I have a neat story here from the book 7 Years in Tibet, upon which the movie is based. This says, he wished to enact new laws, but met with bitter opposition from his conservative entourage, who quoted utterances of the fifth Dalai Lama on the same context. Now, so that is to say, the Dalai Lama was wanting to change something, and his associates are saying no. The previous Dalai Lama said no. To which the 13th Dalai Lama replied, and who was the fifth former body? The monks thereupon prostrated themselves before him, for his answer had left them speechless. As an incarnation, he was of course not only the 13th, but also the 5th, and all the other Dalai Lamas as well. That just perfectly encapsulates the notion of reincarnation. And another thing I have from the 7 Years in Tibet movie is a clip you can link to on your own time here. Don't click on it while you're watching this presentation, or else it'll throw off your timing. But you can go back later and do it. It's from YouTube, and it's a scene where Brad Pitt, who represents the character Heinrich Harrer, is a Austrian mountaineer, and he's stranded in Tibet for 7 years during World War II. And he actually encounters the young Dalai Lama and teaches him about the West and teaches him English. And in this scene, you have a meeting between the two for the first time, and the Dalai Lama wanting to have Harrer build him a movie theater. And what's most interesting about it is the worms and what they do with the worms when they're constructing it. It has an interesting teaching about reincarnation on there. The Buddhist service pamphlet here, I'll just say a couple things about, and then show you a couple pictures and wrap this thing up so we can get done in about an hour's time. You have the offering of the mandala in there. You have a supplication to Tara. You have the prayer for liberating the 6 beings of the different realms. Tonglen meditation. And then the dedication of merit, as I mentioned, as well as long life for the Dalai Lama. And just read through those if you're interested. I'm not going to test you specifically on any of them other than the basic notions I already talked about in previous slides. But you can see an example there of what Buddhists will do on a given Sunday. And Sunday isn't, by the way, the day they have to worship, but in Kansas City at that particular Buddhist center, that's when they happen to do it. So here are some pictures from my experience in India. This is this huge statue of Buddha outside the sacred place of the Bodhi tree, and there's a little temple beside it that's from about 500 AD, I believe, so extremely ancient. I have a little story here on this next picture. There's our group in front of Buddha. Right after this picture's taken, I was walking along with another woman there, and we're clearly very white, right? Well, this little dark-skinned kid, probably 2 years old, sees us and screams and runs back away trying to find his mother. What's funny is they may have never seen white people before. We're scary to them. Can you imagine, no matter what skin color you are, if you'd never seen anybody of the other skin color before, and what your response would be? And needless to say, there aren't many Westerners who come to Bodh Gaya. And these other slides just show different types of Buddhist monasteries in that town. These are all situated along a solitary road. It's basically, as one person there put it, like the Vatican for Buddhists, because at the Vatican you have nuns from all over the world, monks, priests, all these different religious robes you'll see. Well, you have here a Tibetan monastery, then you have the Japanese one, then you have the Burmese one, and that's just 3 of about 12 or 15 that I could have put on the presentation. and each of them you can go into. You don't have to be Buddhist. And I just gave you one shot here of an interior to illustrate what it would look like. Typically, you'll have a statue of the Buddha in the center, which people can use to focus their prayer on. So I'm going to wrap up our discussion of Buddhism at that point. I recommend you read more in the Novak Reader for selections and examples. Again, the 7 Years in Tibet movie is well worth watching, and the Buddhist Service booklet. I also think that reading from Chomei, the account of my hut, is interesting reading. And then we're going to pick up and move to a very different type of religion next as we go to the Middle East and the religion of Islam.